safe, familiar. And then change comes. It interrupts us, throws us into chaos, threatens to break us. But out of the brokenness, beauty. That's life.
All right, we are finishing our series of Life in Transition here this morning with a message from the book of Esther. I've titled the message, Three Essentials of Life. Now, if you like, maybe this phrase, some of these phrases will sound familiar. Just cut to the chase. We understand what that means, or boil it down, or give me just the basics, or what do I need to know? Or I'm going to give you the Reader's Digest version. If you're a student, we call that, can I get the Cliff Notes? Right? I mean, you want to know the short stuff, just get to the point. So this morning, we're going to do, I haven't done this before, I've not done it quite like this before. We're actually going to do the entire book of Esther. I'm going to give you the Cliff Note version, all right? So if you've got your Bibles, turn to the book of Esther, and we're going to kind of walk you through the highlights of it to get to these points. Because here's my message this morning. What is it that is essential to life? And I want to give you three things from the story of Esther as we go through there. Here's your first. You got the little program that you've got there. There's three blanks on there I can give you. Number one, the first essential, or the first essential we're going to cover here this morning is wisdom. Wisdom. Now, wisdom is not knowledge, right? It's not knowledge. Wisdom is knowing what to do with the knowledge and what the information, to know what to do with that. That's wisdom. Now, the context of the story, the context of what's going on in the book of Esther is that you've got the king of Persia. His name is Ahasuerus, or his more familiar name is Xerxes. All right, so more popular by that name. But here's what happens. Xerxes is having the party to blow out all parties. This is a 6-month party that's going on in the capital. And they've been going at it and going at it and going at it. And Vashti, the queen, is entertaining the women, and they have their party, and the men have their party. And the truth is, they've had way too much to drink. And what happens is the king calls Vashti, because the text says that Vashti is a beautiful woman. He calls her and he says, hey, he sends word, tell Vashti I want her to come because I want to show her off to all of my guests. And Vashti knows exactly what's going on. She sends back word, I am not coming to that party. Well, that doesn't go over very well with the king. You don't tell the king no. And so all of the leaders get together, and all the rulers are there, and they go, we can't do this. And so anyway, they make the decision to get rid of Vashti as the queen. And so Xerxes starts, and this is where we're going to pick up the story. Xerxes starts his search for a new queen. And that's where we pick up with our verses. And we're just going to read highlighted verses as we go through the story today. But we're going to read verses 7, 10, 15, and 20. Pop up verse 7. We'll start the story here. It says, Mordecai, and by the way, so the story picks up. You've got Esther and Mordecai. All right. So Mordecai is their cousins. So here's how the story goes. Mordecai had a cousin named Hadassah, whom he had brought up because she had neither father nor mother. This young woman, who was also known as Esther, had a lovely figure and was beautiful. Mordecai had taken her as his own daughter when her father and mother died. Fast forward at verse 10. Esther had not revealed her nationality and family background because Mordecai had forbidden her to do so. Verse 15. When the turn came for Esther, the young woman Mordecai had adopted, the daughter of his uncle Abishai, to go to the king, she asked for nothing other than what Haggai, the king's eunuch, who was in charge of the harem, suggested. And Esther won the favor of everyone who saw her. And now 20. But Esther had kept secret her family background and nationality, just as Mordecai had told her to do, for she continued to follow Mordecai's instructions as she had done when he was bringing her up. So here's how the story goes. wisdom. So Xerxes has this contest to pick the new queen. Esther's in the running. Mordecai says to her, we are in Persia. You are not Persian. Just keep it to yourself that you're Jewish. You don't need to tell everybody who your family and who your heritage is. Just go through the process. It'll be fine. Don't tell people what's going on. And so she does not. Now, it's called wisdom. Mordecai knew that this was not the smart thing, the wise thing to do at this time. And so he does that. Now, you may have had some wisdom that you got from your parents, a little parental wisdom. Maybe you remember some of the things that were said. This was one that was very common in my house. I grew up, we had 5 siblings. And so this phrase was said frequently at my home, probably on a at least weekly basis. My mother said, if you don't have anything nice to say, do we have the same mother? Don't say anything at all. If you don't have anything nice to say, don't say anything at all. That's a little piece of wisdom. Several years ago, I don't know when they first came out, but I remember seeing this shirt. And it was a Christian t-shirt. If you're a Christian, you got it really fast. It had big bold letters on it. It said, turn or burn. Remember that one? I got to tell you, in all the years, I never saw anybody see that shirt fall down and go, you know, you're right, I need to turn. It never really struck a chord. Now, I did know some people that got a little bit offended at it. It wasn't a very wise thing to do. It really wasn't going to accomplish the goal. Mordecai says, you don't need to tell people that you're Jewish. This is not the moment. Keep it to yourself. This is not the time. If you've ever been to a restaurant, maybe someplace, and maybe even a movie or something, you're going places, and there's this little kid, little toddler, little somebody, and they're having a meltdown. I mean, they are really letting it fly, right? And after a while, you're thinking, you know, I could tell them what to do with that kid. And you have a moment, and you experience this thing called wisdom. Because wisdom says, hold your tongue. It's not your place. I've got some verses I want to give you so you can kind of write these. You can jot a couple references down to give you a Here's Proverbs chapter 21, verse 23. Those who guard their mouths and their tongues keep themselves from calamity. Proverbs 12, verse 18. The words of the reckless pierce like swords, but the tongue of the wise bring healing. Proverbs 17:9. Whoever would foster love covers over an offense, but whoever repeats the matter separates close friends. And Ephesians 4:29, last one. Do not let any unwholesome talk come out of your mouths, but only what is helpful for building others up according to their needs, that it may benefit those who listen. So here's when you're contemplating that moment of what you should say or not say, here's the 3 things. 3 things to measure it by. Number 1, you need to know, is it true? Is what I'm about to say true? All right, that's important. Second thing, is it loving? Is what I'm about to say loving? Third, is it going to be beneficial to the person I say it to? Is it going to help? Or is it just going to cause a problem? If you don't have anything nice to say, don't say anything at all. That's wise. That's wise. All right, now, let's move on through the story, because the first essential in life that you need, that everybody needs, is wisdom. Second one. Look at the second point is guts, by the way, in your outline, and we're going to read from chapter 2, verse 21. Chapter 2, verse 21. During the time Mordecai was sitting at the king's gate, Bigthana and Teresh, 2 of the king's officers who guarded the doorway, became angry and conspired to assassinate King Xerxes. But Mordecai found out about the plot and told Queen Esther, who in turn reported it to the king, giving credit to Mordecai. So there's the scenario, right? Mordecai just happens to be sitting at the gate. Esther is now the queen. She's been selected. She's up in here, and there's this plot to assassinate the king. And Mordecai hears it, and he passes the word on. Now, the story, and this is where we're going to kind of hop through the chapters real quickly. In chapter 3, here's what happens next. So by the way, the king is saved. The assassins are executed, and on they go. Chapter 3, they introduce you to a guy by the name of Haman. Haman is a political character. He gets raised up in the system, and he's like the number 2 guy in the country. Now, here's what happens. He thinks, and this is a pretty big deal. He gets everywhere he goes, it's Haman. He's a great guy. Look, he's always so important. And people start bowing down and giving him all kind of honor because he's the number 2 guy. He's really important. And he walks around, and all of a sudden he comes up to Mordecai, and he expects Mordecai to give him respect and bow down. And Mordecai just sits there. And they tell him, this is Haman. You should probably bow down. He goes, no, I'm a Jew. And we know there's only one that we bow to. And it isn't Haman. And so Haman just goes crazy. He's like, I can't. And he starts having a meltdown. And he thinks, you know what? I can fix this. I'm Haman. And he makes plans to to kill Mordecai. And while he's at it, he goes, you know what? He's one of those Jewish people. They're just troublemakers. We'll just get rid of all of them. We'll go ahead and annihilate all of the Jews in the land. And he makes this grand and glorious plan to do that. And so Haman does this. He creates the plan. And by the way, Haman has no idea that Esther is Jewish. By the way, neither does King Xerxes. And so here comes Haman. He walks into Xerxes. He says, I got this plan. We got this group of people out here that pay no attention to our laws, no attention to our culture. We just need to get rid of them. And by the way, I think I can bring a lot of money into the coffers. And the king says, well, I think that's a pretty good idea. And he signs off on it. And then that begins the plan to get rid of and to kill all of the Jews. So what happens then, you get to chapter 4. Mordecai hears this plan about getting rid of all of the Jews, and he sends word to Esther. He says, you got to do something about this. This is not a good thing. You need to make a plea to King Xerxes to save us. And Esther says, there's only one problem. You can't just walk into the king's presence uninvited. If you do, you can be executed on the spot. You don't just walk in. And I haven't seen the king in 30 days. He hasn't called me. She says, this is probably not a good idea. And this is where the story, and it picks up chapter 4. We've got chapter 4, verses 13 to 16. I'm going to read a couple of these to you. So, this is Mordecai. He sent back this answer. Do not think that because you are in the king's house, you alone of all Jews will escape. For if you remain silent at this time, relief and deliverance for the Jews will rise from another place, but you and your father's family will perish. And who knows but that you have come to your royal position for such a time as this? Then Esther sent this reply to Mordecai. One more. Go gather together all the Jews who are in Susa and fast for me. Do not eat or drink for 3 days, night or day. I and my attendants will fast as you do. When this is done, I will go to the king, even though it is against the law. And if I perish, I perish. Here's the story. So you're getting a sense of what it takes, which is guts, right? It takes a lot of guts, or a more spiritual word for that would be faith. For you to be able to step out in the middle of this thing and do what Mordecai did, to reveal the plan to assassinate the king. He puts himself in danger. To do what Esther does, to follow the instructions, to do what he calls, and then to suddenly be confronted with this. You've got to go do something about this, and she has to decide. Takes a lot of guts. Well, and you see it, right? If I perish, I perish. I'm going to have to do whatever it is, whatever it takes. I'm going to step out in faith. Now, we get chapter 5, verses 1 to 4, because the story continues right after this. On the 3rd day, Esther put on her royal robes and stood at the inner court of the palace in front of the king's hall. The king was sitting on his royal throne in the hall, facing the entrance. when he saw Queen Esther standing in the court, he was pleased with her and held out to her the gold scepter that was in his hand. So Esther approached and touched the tip of the scepter. Then the king asked, "What is it, Queen Esther? What is your request? Even up to half the kingdom, it will be given you." "If it pleases the king," replied Esther, "let the king, together with Haman, come today to a banquet I've prepared for him." All right, so here's where the story gets a little interesting. So, and by the way, Haman's sitting, he goes, and the king says, "Hey, we've been invited to go to a banquet with Queen Esther." And Haman has this moment, right? He's like, this is it. The king loves me. The queen loves me. She invites me to a special banquet. This is my greatest moment. In fact, I'm going to make it the trifecta. We're just going to go build some gallows, and I'm going to hang old Mordecai the second I get when we're all done. He's got a plan. We'll start this thing early. He has no idea what's about to happen. And here's my thought. When it comes to guts and faith, there's a fine line between guts and stupidity. Right? It's a very fine line. You need to know, we need to know the difference between the two. And here's a couple of examples. In Acts chapter 9, we're introduced to this guy by the name of Paul, who was Saul, right? And here's what happens. Saul was the guy that was running around killing everybody, and he suddenly meets Christ, and Christ changes his life, and he starts going out and proclaiming that. Well, all those people that liked him before hate him now and are going to kill him. And they start chasing him down, and he gets up into this room, and they're coming to get him, and they say, "You know what?" Paul says, "Can you put me in a basket and let me out the window on ropes, out over the wall, and gone?" And that's what they did. Now, how come Paul didn't go, "You know what? Jesus loves me. Come get me." He didn't do that. He didn't say, "I serve God. I can take it. You can't touch me." He said, "Put me in the basket and let's get out of here." There's a fine line between guts and stupidity. Paul knew that this was not the moment, that God had another place and another purpose for his life. This was not the time for this. You have another story where Jesus and Satan in the temptation. It's Luke chapter 4. Satan takes Jesus up to the pinnacle of the temple, and he says, "You know what? Since you're the Son of God, since you're the Messiah, why don't you just toss yourself off? Let's show everybody. Let's do this thing. Let's get this thing over with right now. Throw yourself off the pinnacle, float down to the earth, let his angels catch you, and everything will be great." And Jesus says, No, that's not how this happens. Don't test or tempt God. He could have done it, but he said that's not how God intends this thing to happen. He knew what the purpose and the plan of God was for his life, and that was not it. It was not that moment. What is God's purpose in your life? When you're faced with the moment where you have to make the decision and you're contemplating, is this a faith issue for me? Is this a guts thing? Is this a wise thing for me to do? Or is this not? You need to know what is God's purpose for your life. And are you then willing to step out? Now, for you, that may have been a situation. You may have been going, should I take this job? Or is this the job that God has for me to take? Should I step out and do this? You can have all kinds of scenarios. You do the paper, right? You pros and cons, and you start writing out all the stuff. Is this the right decision for me and for my life? And you're really asking, what does God want to do in my life? What is the wise thing? What is the faith thing? What is God calling me to do? It could be a relationship that you've in your life and you're trying to make a decision. And you know what? The truth is, not everything makes sense when you get it down on paper, does it? I mean, you can write it out, and you should, because it's the wise thing to do. You write it down and you start thinking about it and you go, God, what do you want me to do in my life? And that's the smart thing to do. It's the wise thing to do. And you decide, okay, God, is this where you want me? And when you come to that point where you say, yes, I know, and you go, I know I have to do this. Even though it doesn't line up on paper, I know I have to do this. This is God's will for my life. If you know some folks, Entrepreneurs, people who like to they're people who like to jump out, right? They get an idea in their head. They decide, I think this is a great idea. And they start making a plan and they put it out on paper. And a lot of times they go, I don't know if I can make the numbers crunch. You know they're an entrepreneur when they go, yeah, but I know I got to do it. And they jump. That's this faith thing. That's this, what does it take? It takes guts, it takes wisdom, it takes a faith moment for us when we get to that point in our lives. That's Mordecai. That's Esther at this moment. It is a big deal when she does this and steps up in before the king. So let me give you the third essential of life. Wisdom and guts, and the third is, I know this is going to be a shocker for you, God. God is a life essential for you. Jesus is a life essential for you. Now, in the story, by the way, you may or may not have known this. Do you know that God's name never actually appears in the book of Esther? It's the only book in the Bible where that's true. It's a little bit odd. But God shows up in every chapter. Follow along in the story and you can see God showing up at every point along the way, even though he's unnamed. You end up with, in chapter 2, you've got Mordecai sitting by the gate, and for some reason he just happens to hear two guards talk about assassinating the king. Just happens to hear it. God brought about that moment to save the king and to promote Mordecai and to promote Esther. It was all a part of God's movement in his people's lives. You follow that story along from Haman and all the crazy stuff that happened in that story, and God intervening, and Haman deciding, I've got to tell the king, I've got to tell Esther, we've got to get an intervention in all of this. All of that is God's moving in and out of that story. When you get to chapter 6, the king goes to bed. He's had a wild day. He can't sleep. Now, I wonder who made that happen. Hey, would you bring me the history books? Because I'm sure that'll put me to sleep. Just let me read some history. And the guy comes in, starts reading to him, and he gets to the part in history books where it talks about how Mordecai saved the king. And he says to the guy who's reading the story, by the way, did we ever do anything for him? No, we haven't. Huh. He gets up in the morning, things are still going. He calls Haman, his number 2 man, in. He says, Haman, hey, what do you think the king should do for the person he really wants to honor? And Haman's going, yeah, this is me. This is my moment. He goes, well, you should give him a robe. The king's robe. You should give him a ring. You should put him on the king's horse. You should parade him around town and tell everybody, here's what happens to the person that the king really wants to honor. And the king goes, you're right. Can you go get that stuff and do it for Mordecai? Oh, boy. Who does that? God does that. God shows up in the middle of that and makes all of that happen to bring about God's purpose, to save his people, to elevate Mordecai, to elevate Esther, to bring all of this together. It's God's involvement in that. Now, we didn't read, but chapter 7 verses 1 to 6 is the story of the leading up to this, the second banquet. Here's how it reads. So the king and Haman went to Queen Esther's banquet. And as they were drinking wine on the second day, the king again asked Queen Esther, what is your petition? It will be given you. What is your request? Even up to half the kingdom it will be granted. Then Queen Esther answered, if I have found favor with you, your majesty, and if it pleases you, grant me my life. This is my petition. And spare my people. This is my request. For I and my people have been sold to be destroyed, killed, and annihilated. If we had merely been sold as male and female slaves, I would have kept quiet, because no such distress would justify disturbing the king. King Xerxes asked Queen Esther, who is he? Where is he, the man who has dared to do such a thing? Esther said, an adversary, an enemy, this vile Haman. Then Haman was terrified before the king and queen. Boy, that's a sudden turn of events. Who does that? God does that. God steps into the middle of all of the craziness and turns everything. It takes wisdom, it takes guts, it takes God to get involved in your life. By the way, so the story ends up, Haman knows he's in trouble, right? The king goes out of the room. Haman throws himself down at Esther's feet and begs for his life, and he's grabbing onto Esther, begging for his life, when the king walks back in the room and sees Haman looking like he's attacking the queen. And that's the end of Haman. They take him out and hang him on his own gallows that he made in his backyard for Mordecai. End of story. God intervenes in that life. And as the story goes, chapter 8, okay, so they've got this decree that they can't change, so they have to issue a new decree. So chapter 8, they issue a new decree that says all the Jews can defend themselves, protect themselves, and defend themselves. So they do that. Chapter 9, all the enemies are defeated. Chapter 10, Mordecai gets promoted to second in command. Haman's job. Mordecai gets it. How's that happen? God does that. God shows up. He is the life essential for us. Does God need to have a neon sign where you can see it that says, God alert, God alert. God's moving, God's moving. Or can you just see it if you're paying attention in your life? God is moving in and out of our lives every day at every level, and no matter how our lives are going, God is moving. The question is, are you missing him? Have you missed what Jesus is doing in your life? Because if you miss what Jesus is doing, you have missed everything. You've missed it all. You've missed the point. It may be at your job. God shows up. That conversation that you had at work. That student that you were talking to at school. The person that you ran into at Starbucks and just happened to ask you a question. Do you really need a sign that says God alert? God's moving? Hello, hello, hello. God shows up. It's our moment to follow Christ, to follow God, to exercise wisdom and guts and be willing to step out and to follow Christ and to follow God, whatever that is in your life. This stuff doesn't happen randomly in our lives. The story, you can read the story and go, well, that just kind of happens, No, it doesn't just happen. These things in our lives don't happen randomly. God does it on purpose in your life. Question is, are you going to respond in faith with guts and wisdom? Are you going to follow Christ? You didn't just happen to show up here at church today. God put you here this morning. God moves in and out of your life every day. What's your response going to be? I want to encourage you. Step out in faith and follow Christ. Even when you don't understand. Even when it doesn't make sense. Even when you can't put it down on paper and go, well, let's see. I've got all the pros and cons here. I guess I should follow Jesus. You need to step out in your life. Maybe it's in your home. Maybe it's at your job. Maybe it's at school. Maybe it's with your friends. Wherever it is, you need to step out and show some guts. Show some faith. Does that make you feel better if I say faith? Faith. You got to step out. He calls all of us to do that. It may be baptism. It may be following Christ for the first time. Saying, yes, I'm going to, you know what? You're right. I've been just kind of looking at it on the outside and just kind of playing with it. Maybe I have some friends that are Christians, maybe my family, my spouse, whoever it may be, and I'm just kind of, it's time. Step out. Let's pray. Father, as we come this morning, we're reminded that you are moving in and out of our lives every day. You show up. You invite us to follow you. You intervene in ways that sometimes we notice and sometimes we don't. And yet you do, because you love us. Father, it is our prayer that we would show some faith. Be willing to step out and do what you call us to do. Be willing to obey. Live our lives in a way that's wise. Right words for the right moment, for the right place at the right time. God, make us wise, that we might represent Christ well, that we might represent you well, that you might use us to be that moment, to intervene, speak life. Pray these things in Christ's name. Amen. Would you stand with me? We're going to sing, and got several songs we're going to sing and enjoy a time of just asking God, okay, God, here I am. What do you want to say? That's also an opportunity for you to respond. If that's you this morning and you go, okay, I'm ready. I get it. I'm ready. We invite you. I'll meet you here. You can come and pray. You can come back to a back room. We've got folks who'll pray with you back there as well. So I need to talk to somebody about this. I can see God in my life. I saw him do this and this, and you start to connect the dots, right? You connect the dots, and you go, God's been doing this in my life. Yes, he has. We want to invite you to say yes. Whatever that is. Following Christ, baptism, being a part of El Camino, whatever it is that God's calling you to do. This is a time for you. So as we sing, you can come and pray. Whatever you need to do, you do as we sing.